Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the History Center. Thank you for joining us for this year's Centennial Family Awards. The Centennial Family Awards celebrate families who have lived in Lake Forest or Lake Bluff for 100 years or more. Our Centennial Awards program began in 2006, and since then we have honored 35 local families. The Casselberry family this year will be the 36th. There are a couple things special about this year's Centennial Family Awards. One is it works in concert with our current exhibit, Deeply Rooted and Rising High, the history of Black experiences in Lake Forest. And there are pieces of Casselberry family history on display in that exhibit. If you haven't already seen them, you certainly can after the presentation tonight. In particular, there's a dress that you'll see a picture of in the presentation, which is on display in the corner of the exhibit room, so please check that out. But the other reason that this year we have a special opportunity to hear some personal reminiscences. So Jackie Casselberry King has been working on writing family memories and has generously agreed to share some of her wonderful stories with us. And also Jack and Joan Casselberry's business partner, Ken Aldridge, will say a few words about their partnership. But first, I'm going to start us off with an overview of Casselberry family history in Lake Forest. So we'll begin the story with Edmund Casselberry. You can see pictured up here. He was born in 1863 in Troup County, Georgia. And Edmund's mother, Celia Casselberry, was enslaved by the Marchman family. His biological father was George Presley Marchman, and he had raped Celia. He was the teenage son of Celia's white enslaver. And Marchman died at age 18 in 1865 at the Battle of Fort Tyler, one of the last battles of the Civil War, which took place actually a week after Robert E. Lee had surrendered. So by 1880, Edmund, Celia, her husband, Benjamin Casselberry, and many of Edmund's Casselberry half-siblings had migrated about 40 miles northwest to Randolph County, Alabama. And there, Edmund farmed and worked in carpentry and construction. When he became engaged to Emma Bowen in 1892, he wouldn't get married until he had finished the house that he was building for them in Wedowee, which we can see pictured here, both in the early 1900s and more recently. The house still stands. So Emma Bowen Casselberry was known in family lore as a wanderer. She was part African American and part Native American ancestry. Her father, Joshua Bowen, was Creek, and we'll hear a bit more about him later. But she and Edmund Casselberry had 13 children. Yes, 6 of whom are pictured here, the oldest 6. And it was the 3 oldest boys, Guy Casselberry, William, and Arthur, who would eventually migrate to Lake Forest. So neighbors of the Casselberrys in Wedowee were the Green family, Andrew Jackson Green and his wife Elizabeth. A.J. Green at center stood about 7 feet tall, which you can somewhat see in this photograph. He is dwarfing what does not appear to be an insignificantly sized car right there. So a biography that I found of A.J. Green calls him, quote, East Alabama's most versatile character, and noted that few men in East Alabama occupied a larger field of usefulness. And he was a man of many talents. He farmed, he worked as a merchant, and was involved in politics, as well as his main career, which was in religion. So in the early 1900s, Reverend Green served for many years as the pastor of Zion Rest Baptist Church in Wedowee. And the church building, pictured here, was built in 1895 by none other than Edmund Casselberry, and then was significantly renovated in 1915 by his son, Arthur Casselberry. So this local church, though, was not the only point of connection for the Casselberry and Green families. In the 1910s, the second and third oldest Casselberry brothers, William and Arthur, married the 2 oldest Green sisters, Viola and Texana. who had been continuing their education at Straight College in New Orleans. So sometime before 1917, William and Arthur's older brother, Guy Casselberry, migrated north from Alabama to Lake Forest, Illinois. And their link to this far-flung community may have been Meeks Johnson, who had come up to Lake Forest from Alabama around 1910 and had worked as a chauffeur before starting his own stormwater vault cleaning business in the teens. And so Guy Casselberry found a carpenter job in the new town, but nearly just as he arrived in Lake Forest, he departed, serving as a private overseas in World War I. You can see his draft registration card there. And by 1922, Guy Casselberry and his young family established themselves further south on the North Shore in Evanston, where they would live for decades. However, before he left Lake Forest, he was able to provide introductions for his two younger brothers and their families. Because William and Viola Casselberry and Arthur and Texana Casselberry both came to Lake Forest in 1922. And all were part of the larger wave of black residents making their way to northern and midwestern cities at that time, known as the Great Migration. So Arthur Casselberry started off by taking on various jobs to establish the family in Lake Forest, but always also working in carpentry and construction. And he built a home for himself and Texana at 275 Washington Road. No longer extant, it stood on Washington just south of Maplewood. And you can see the outline circled on this sandboard fire insurance map from 1926. So it was in this house that Arthur and Texana's son, James Casselberry, was born in 1927. Then in 1931, Arthur built a new house for his family, this one's still standing, on the north end of town in the growing black neighborhood on Spruce Avenue. And so this is a recent photo of 440 Spruce, which would remain in the Casselberry family for decades. So Texana Green Casselberry also worked to support the family, doing housework, cooking, and laundry for affluent Lake Forest families. And she was a leader at First Baptist Church. She presided over the Mission Society there and sang in the choir. In 1937, she and Arthur divorced. He moved to Ohio and then later Massachusetts, while she stayed and served as a mainstay for her son James, as well as for her niece and nephews after her sister Viola Green Casselberry died in 1946. And later, she worked for many years as a caterer and did remarry to Marion Wilson. Yes. So cute. So here you can see Texana and Arthur's son, James Casselberry. He's pictured right at the center with his 4th grade class at Halsey School. Then for 7th and 8th grade, he went on to Gorton School, where he was elected to the student council. And Jim played football and ran track in later years at Lake Forest High School and graduated in 1945. He then went on to attend Howard University for a few years before returning to Lake Forest and working at Great Lakes Naval Station. So then in 1950, James Casselberry enlisted in the Army and served in Korea for 2 years, attaining the rank of sergeant. And you can see Jim pictured here, bundled up outside the tent on Christmas Day, 1951, with his friend Fred Rice, who was later in the 1980s the first African-American head of the Chicago Police Department. So Jim met Fred en route to Korea. They were 2 of the only black members of the unit. The pair were shipped off together to San Francisco, teared up as the Golden Gate Bridge faded, and they were on their way across the Pacific. And they arrived together in Korea in the middle of the night. The 2 were sent to an especially chilly barracks as sleeping quarters, which in the morning they discovered was actually the morgue. Yes. So, it was then that they made a pact to stand back to back to survive this war on two fronts, both their fellow soldiers and the enemy. So, upon returning to Lake Forest in 1952, Jim Casselberry was swept up in a whirlwind romance with the woman pictured here, Mary Frances Williams. And they met while she was a student at Northwestern University. She was also on the women's golf team. And when Jim and Mary met at a campus party, he apparently tried to impress her by boasting about golf skills that he did not possess. She, however, saw right through him. She said, "Sure, let's play golf tomorrow. What's your handicap?" And he said, "I don't have a handicap." So she knew that golf maybe wasn't in their future, but marriage was just 6 weeks later. So granddaughter of a midwife, daughter of a nurse, medicine was in Mary Williams Casselberry's blood, so to speak. So after graduating with honors from DuSable High School in Chicago, she pursued this interest at Northwestern University. But it was here that a professor denied her a grade she had earned, a grade that would have put her into medical school. And so this racist action sort of fueled her determination, as she instead entered a training program at Michael Reese Hospital and earned her certification as a medical technologist. In 1960, Mary Casselberry joined the staff at Lake Forest Hospital and went on to run Lake Forest Hospital's laboratory for over 30 years. She was a pioneer in her field. She played a vital role in developing the hospital's innovative blood component therapy unit, which was a breakthrough in the treatment of blood-based illnesses. So when in 1959, Jim and Mary Casselberry returned to Lake Forest after several years of living and working in Brockton, Massachusetts, they moved into 440 Spruce with Jim's mother, Texana. So the family, then grown to 5, lived there for 10 years. As Mary Casselberry said at one point, "I can't get out of my mother-in-law's house." But it wasn't for lack of trying. At that time, there were race-based housing restrictions, both overt and tacit, that were in place until Lake Forest passed an open housing ordinance in 1968. So it was hard to find another house. Quoted later in the Chicago Tribune, Jim said, "There was a time when I wanted to buy a house somewhere else. I had to go with the real estate agent to look at it after dark. I put in a bid on it, but I guess word snuck out that Jim and Mary Casselberry wanted that house because about a week later, it was bulldozed to the ground." Yeah. Finally, in 1969, Jim got word from the president of First National Bank of Lake Forest, Frank Reed, that the lot next door along Sheridan was for sale. And so Jim went up to the bank, put the money down, signed the papers, and closed on the land that very week. So later building the home pictured here, 460 Spruce. So by the 1960s, the Casselberry family had been in Lake Forest for over 4 decades and was one of the older, well-established families in the community. They were often featured in the local newspaper, the Lake Forester. And so here, Janae Casselberry shows off her first prize winning nature scavenger hunt poster for a garden club contest. So not to be outdone, her little brother Jim Casselberry went for no less than the cover of the Lake Forester. So here you can see him pictured with 2 young friends playing in the nursery school playground at the Church of the Holy Spirit. All right. So here you can see 2 images from a very 1970s family photo session of the Casselberrys. So Jim and Mary with their children Janae, Robin, and Jim Jr. And the photo on the left was included in the 1976 First Presbyterian Church directory. So both Jim and Mary were very active at First Pres, with Jim as an usher and deacon for 40 years, and Mary as deacon, elder, and member of the session. And the pair were also very involved in the community. Mary served as supervisor of the city of Lake Forest and on many, many boards, including that of Lake Forest College. And Jim and Mary became surrogate parents for many Black students at the college over the years, hosting them for dinners and holidays and introducing them to Lake Forest and the North Shore. So Jim and Mary placed a high value on education and were proud of their high-achieving family, with all their children graduating from college and going on to earn advanced degrees. Janae was at Harvard, Robin at Smith, Jim at the University of Illinois. And so here you can see some photographs of the family from more recent decades. Okay, so now I'm going to slide back in time a little bit to pick up the story of the other Casselberry brother who migrated to Lake Forest in 1922, William Casselberry, who's pictured here with his wife Viola Green Casselberry. So in 1924, William Casselberry built this house at 421 Spruce, which would remain the family for decades, though another house stands on the site today. Their two oldest children, Willie Lee and Jackson Edward Casselberry, were born in Alabama. And the youngest, William Jr., was born just after moving to Lake Forest in 1922. So Viola Casselberry ran a laundry service out of the home with a regular list of clients, which included the Cudahays, the Swifts, and the Curtises. And she was also the president of the Mothers' Council of the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA. Planning events, which you can see in the articles there, bringing in speakers for this networking group of Black mothers in the community. So the oldest child, Willie Lee, was a talented musician and performer. She danced in many recitals, some held at Ravinia. And like her mother, she was involved in the YWCA. She led the Keep Tryst Girls Reserve in the 1930s. And then the youngest, William Jr. or Bill, served in World War II and went on to become a career officer. So you can see him pictured here in the Tribune with his wife Betty and daughter Stephanie as they arrived to greet him in Japan in 1948. So initially working as a laborer and gardener on the estates in Lake Forest, William Casselberry Sr. Saw business opportunities in hauling, snow plowing, waste removal, especially for properties outside the city limits. In 1943, he took over John Watson Jordan's garbage route, establishing William Casselberry Company. A few years before that, William and Viola had divorced, and William remarried and had more children, Ted, Donald, Barbara, Ronald, and Betty Lou, who were contemporaries in age, really, with his grandchildren. As business grew, he needed more space for the trucks and bought a few acres of property at the western edge of town at 660 Bradley Road for a home and garages. And the land purchase apparently had to be made by his attorney because several residents in the Bradley Road area protested having an African-American neighbor. So Casselberry Company ran garbage routes. They picked up from Lake Forest College, from other businesses in town. They planted lawns. They put in shrubberies, put driveways in. They cleaned catch basins and septic tanks. At one point, William's son Ted recalled that they sold Lake Forest High School 200 truckloads of dirt for a landscaping project. So William wanted his older sons to be involved in the business, especially as he advanced in years, and in the 1950s he brought in Jack Casselberry, who took over upon William's death in 1966. And Jack and his wife Joan continued to professionalize and expand the operation, as we'll hear in a bit. In the 1970s, Jack sold Casselberry Incorporated to Waste Management. But at that time, his cousin Jim Casselberry bought the sewer and septic portion of the business and formed James Casselberry and Son, which continued to grow through the next 3 decades and bring in business from all across Lake County and became a ubiquitous name all throughout Lake Forest. All right, so meanwhile, in the 1970s, Jack Casselberry partnered with another local businessman to form a new operation. So to tell this story, I'm going to pause and I'm going to introduce Ken Aldridge and invite him to come forward for a moment. He's the current chairman of the board at Aldridge and with his father, a partner of Jack and Joan Casselberry at All Cass Electric. So thank you for sharing the story, Ken.
Thank you for that. So just briefly, the Jack Casselberry that I knew was a tall, good-looking man, smart, and had this really nice demeanor about him. He was just a lot of fun. Successful businessman in Lake Forest, well-respected in the community. And he and my dad were friends, and we all lived in town together, and they'd known each other for some time. And in 1976, they were having some conversations about creating a new construction company together. And the genesis of that was that the Federal Transportation in Washington had come out with new guidelines to help foster minority-owned businesses. And some friends in Springfield reached out to Jack and said, hey, you should think about this. So he and my father teamed up and started a business in 1976, and they named it Cass Electric. And they right away started bidding highway construction work in northern Illinois, and we worked out of Jack's office at Leola Drive in Lake Bluff, where he was still running his other businesses. Jack and Joan were there every day. The company grew steadily. They were hiring electricians, picking up contracts, and it was going really well. And it started expanding out to bidding federal work and at Great Lakes Naval Training Center in Fort Sheridan. My father, Lynn, passed only 3 years later in '79, and we were just really getting started, and Jack asked us, my brother and sister, Susie and I, and would we like to continue? And we said, yeah, we'd love to do this, and we really liked Jack. We just really had met him, and he's just a great guy. So we kept growing the company, adding people, and Jack knew a lot of people and was well respected. The executives at our utility, Commonwealth Edison, said, Jack, come on down and we want to talk to you. And they gave us a lot of work putting in electrical services, and that business grew. And he just was able to open doors. I don't know how he did it, but he knew a lot of people and was just well respected. So it just started growing. And then he got invited to O'Hare Field, was building the international terminal, and they asked us to come down and bid some work, and then we built a lot of contracts up until the time the terminal opened. So it was really a family business, and Jack and Joan were there every day. We had loyal employees, and every August we'd have a company picnic and for the employees, and they'd come, and they really enjoyed the event and meeting the people. And I think the employees really enjoyed meeting Jack and Joan because they were just so warm and approachable people. They were just really, really fun. So over the years, we built some great projects, made a little money, had a lot of fun, and then they decided to retire in 1991. So we had about $26 million in contracts. We finished them up that year, and then we closed it up. So Jack was a great partner. He was a really good friend and a mentor to me. I was a young guy, and working with an experienced businessman like Jack was really helpful for my career and my family life. So it was just a great journey. I was just grateful to have known both of them. That's it.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Ken. We appreciate it. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jackie Casselberry King, who's going to share with us family stories that have been passed down through generations, wonderful memories of her parents, and thoughtful reminiscences of her own experiences growing up and living in this community. And speaking on my part, I know that coalescing family history into a narrative is complex enough as an outsider, but is immeasurably more challenging when it is your own personal story, your own lived experience. So I really want to thank Jackie for her generosity in sharing these family stories with us today. So, Jackie?
I sit. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone. You and Laurie, you and the entire staff, led by Director Carol Sommerfeld, have been flawless as curators, as guides, as professionals, dedicated to telling My family story. I'm not going to make this. Historians who are a credit to their profession, keepers of the flames that are Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. Historians who are dedicated to Black history and not just for a few weeks in February. It has been a privilege to work with you. To the Aldrich family, Kenny, Susie, and Warren, 1,000 times thank you for being here tonight, sharing tonight. Thanks for the memories. Thank you on behalf of Joan, Jack, and my sister Donna. Thanks for the laughs. To the familiar faces I see from the old days, great to see you again. I am honored by your presence. To my classmates, some from as early as nursery school, great to see you again. I am honored by your presence. To my classmates, I said that. To my current Lake Forest neighbors who are here in force, thanks for the posters on the bulletin board regarding tonight. Thank you for spending this evening with my family, Emery King, my husband, and my daughter, Jordan Casselberry King. Jackson Edward Casselberry was 2 years old when his branch of the family migrated north to Lake Forest. His family, including older sister Willa Lee and younger brother Bill, lived with their parents, William and Viola, in the top apartment of a two-family duplex on 421 Spruce Avenue. On a summer day in 1929 or 30, 8-year-old Jack was sitting on the outside steps when he clocked a new model black sedan slowly driving east on Spruce toward him. The driver stopped and motioned my father to the car, where he said he was looking to hire workers for a garden party to take place the next evening. As agreed, this man picked up Jack around 5 p.m. and drove him to a very large home on Green Bay Road. In the kitchen, he was told his duties were to attend to the guests' every need. Then he was dressed in a blackamoor costume. Early in the evening, a guest told Jack he needed my father to exclusively tend to this man's date, a lady who smoked. Jack's charge was to carry cigarettes, lighter, and ashtray at the ready. For that, he received a $10 tip, which in today's dollars has a purchasing power of $181.65. That's when Jack got subcontracting. And that's when he got quid pro quo. And that's how Jack got started. Jackson Edward Casselberry was born in August 23rd, 1920 in Wedowee, Alabama, in the hometown of his father, William. William's mother, Emma, was the daughter of Joshua Bowen, a full-blood Creek Indian, and it's assumed an African-American mother. My father remembered spending the night with his great-grandfather, Joshua Bowen, in the hills of Alabama. Jack was 12 or 13 and recalled the campfire around which they slept. My father, though not a witness, often retold the story Joshua Bowen told him. One day, Joshua Bowen descended those hills for supplies at the white-owned and patronized trading post. Bowen was told by the men there that they were going to give him 24 hours to leave his hills location. If he refused, they would come to the hills to kill him. Story goes that Joshua asked only, "What time did you say I have to be gone?" They answered noon. Around 11 a.m. the next day, as the men ascended, Joshua Bowen, camouflaged in the rocks, picked off and killed each one. Fast forward 100 years, Joshua's great-great-great-granddaughter, Jack's granddaughter, my daughter Jordan Casselberry King, related this story to her third grade history class. as part of an assignment on ancestry. When I picked her up from school that afternoon, I asked, "Well, how did it go? What did your classmates have to say?" Jordan responded, "Mom, they didn't say anything. They just stared at me." I then asked, "Well, what did your teacher say?" She said, Jordan responds, "She just stared at me too." We still laugh about this. This is Daisy Johnson Cohen. Daisy Johnson was born on Hogue Street in Atlanta, Georgia, August 5th, 1894. She had an older sister, Mary, a younger brother, Paul. Daisy married, then divorced in the 1920s. She migrated north with her sister, Mary. Mary chose Chicago. Daisy chose Evanston. Daisy married Eugene Victor Cohen, known as Doc. He was my Papa Doc. Everybody called him Doc. He migrated from South Carolina. They had twin girls, February 16th, 1924, Jean Victoria and my mother, Joan Leola Cohen. 2 pistols. But before 2005 Foster in Evanston, a two-apartment building the Cohens purchased in the early 1930s, they were living on the place, meaning over the garage of a stately Evanston home with Jean and Joan. Daisy cleaned and cooked, Doc, cleaner and chauffeur. My mother told us, my older sister Donna and me, that one day the man of the house was uncharacteristically in the kitchen, talking to my grandmother. He told her he was going to sell his older Buick. He asked if Daisy and Doc were interested. Daisy asked how much. She told him she could do that. The next day, Daisy and Doc were fired. I asked my mother, why would he do that? She answered with this story. The next home was also on the place. At midday in October, the owner came home early and went right to the kitchen. He asked my grandmother if she had any money in the bank, and if so, she was to leave immediately to withdraw. He insisted. The next day, October 29th, 1929, was Black Tuesday, the day of the great stock market crash. Her point to us, take your time making judgments regarding who may come your way and who you should welcome and those you should not. In short, actions speak louder than words. Until then, hold your peace until you better know what should be said or done, if anything. Definitely someone who would have Jack's ear. As previously said, Joan and her sisters were pistols, so were all their Evanston friends who knew each other from cradle to graves. One summer day, they were sitting on a front porch taking in the day, probably 10 of them, around 14 years old. A car drove up and stopped. There was a white woman inside, the woman in the passenger seat. She called to the girls. She said, "Liza, we're lost. Liza, can you tell us how to get to Davis Street?" The friends looked knowingly at each other. They were well aware it was generic with some white people to name you, rather than think you had a proper name. A younger sister of one of the girls walked to the car. Again, the woman called her Liza and repeated her request for directions. My mother's friend very politely asked the woman, "Just how is it you know my name?" The woman answered, "Oh, I just guessed." The young girl answered, "Well, God damn it, guess where Davis Street is?" They were my models growing up. Her friends, Barthenia, Ernestine, Harriet, Clarkie, to name a few. I loved and laughed with each and every one. I got a ringside seat early to a reaction my mother had to racism. I was about 8 years old, and we were in Baker's shoe store. I don't know if any of you remember that. It wasn't far from here. It wasn't expensive, but it was to us. I was excited about the trip. The salesman made it quite clear he did not want to wait on my mother. It was beneath him. When he returned with the shoes, he literally threw the box at her. Before it landed, my mother caught it one-handed and threw it in his face. I said, "Mom, why did you do that?" She said, "I saw it coming." She and her friends did not play. Jack Casselberry was in Lake Forest High School class 1939. He ran track. He was confident he could get an athletic scholarship, but on trial day, he had to work. His parents, William and Viola, divorced at that time. So Viola got a job on the place in Larchmont, New York. Jack drove her there. To make certain she would be all right, he asked her employer if there was a job for him so he could take care of her for a while. There was, he took it, he returned to Lake Forest, met Joan, married her, then went to war. Jack and Joan married in 1942. They moved to that same top floor at 421 Spruce where Jack was raised. In 1942, he was drafted for World War II. Neither he nor Joan knew then she was pregnant. My sister Donna Jean Casselberry was born 1943, July. First base for Jack was Fort Huachuca in Arizona, where he and other black enlistees fought forest fires. Next stop, Italy, with the all-black 92nd Infantry. Like all men and women of that time, he had an abundance of war stories, but not as many have one concerning a court-martial. His squad, all black soldiers, were often the first to the front and the last to leave. Following a particularly brutal siege, they returned to camp in Modena, Italy. He said all of them were hot, tired, dirty, and very hungry. The last thing that was going to stop them was a line at the officers' mess. Men in clean uniforms and fewer kills. Jack and his unit walked to the front of that line, defying some outraged officers used to their privilege. Later that evening or the next, these same black soldiers went into town to a local spot where many of the officers socialized with the locals. One of them approached my father. He said to Jack, "You know, if you and your friends leave, we can go back to having a good time." Jack replied, "Well, expletive deleted, looks like you ain't gonna have one." The officer threw a punch, then ended up on the floor. For that, Jack faced a court-martial. He was represented by Earl Strayhorn, a young black, unbelievably at that time, Army lawyer, playing a seemingly losing hand. He struck a deal with the judges. There would be no dishonorable discharge, but Jack was to immediately return to the front. 50 years later, Jack was celebrated as a Buffalo soldier. named during the 19th century by Native Americans because of their buffalo-like hair and bravery. They were the ones, Eleanor Roosevelt said, those who fought to fight. In the 1970s, I was working at WMAQ News Radio in Chicago. I was sent to interview to the chambers of a prominent judge, Cook County Earl Strayhorn. He remembered Jack's case. Afterward, I called my father and mother to say, as I did so many times, guess where I was today? My father described Strayhorn with his highest praise. Good man, he said. Good man, he repeated. When Jack returned from the war, he, Joan, and my sister were still at 421 Spruce, but then living on the main level. A bedroom on the back with bunk beds for Donna and me. I was born June 17, 1947. One small bath, small kitchen dining room with my parents' bedroom next to the living room. The front door led to a porch where my mom folded clothes in the summer and we watched the world of Spruce Street walk, run, or drive by. On Spruce, my parents were known to our playmates as Miss Joan and Mr. Jack. Both worked, my mother at Great Lakes Naval Station, as did other mothers on Spruce and Edgewood. My father had two jobs, overnight at Cyclone Fence in Waukegan, back home to get us to the school bus, then his morning sleep before he went to his second job at Fort Sheridan. My first notice of what Spruce Street thought of my father is indelible. It's a summer day, families from Edgewood and the south end of town, in lawn chairs, on blankets, some with babies. It's after a 4 p.m. dinner. They're there for a weekly or bi-weekly baseball game, play interrupted by dogs who stole the ball. First base was aligned with our gravel driveway. Probably I wore jeans, cowboy boots, hat, and holster, which I wore most days when riding the back of our worn living room sofa while watching 1950s TV cowboy shows with Donna. I heard one of the younger male players warn his outfield, "Okay, everybody, back, way back. Mr. Jack is up." Financially, times got better. Joan was able to stay at home. I remember the day the good humor man made his expected stop on Spruce. Donna and I were trying to figure out which good humor to choose when my mother said, "How about we buy a box?" Major milestone. Anyone who knew my mom would tell you she was fun. I remember the afternoons when she'd turn on the record player, put on music from the 40s, teach us how to do the shuffle off the buffaloes step or the two-step or the time step. Donna was like my mother, a naturally beautiful dancer. I lacked that gene, as did Jack. I can't carry a tune either. When she'd have the neighborhood kids in, gathered around our old piano, sometimes singing gospels, she would gingerly suggest that perhaps it was best I just mouthed the doors. As did the chorus director when I was in the 6th grade at Deer Path. That didn't get better. When I was 8 and Donna 12, we moved across the street to 386 Spruce, and my parents, who had bought 421, used it as a rental property. Donna and I slept together the first night, even though we now each had a room. My parents always credited Reverend Wayman McIntosh, is he up there? That they were able to make this leap. Reverend McIntosh, many years before, started a garbage business, which he sold to them. Of course, the landscaping came first, considering they were in the landscape business. Jack always did his own yard. That's what he was doing on a late spring Saturday when he spied a car coming from Sheridan Road. The driver decreased his speed as he came up Spruce. He stopped in front of our house, leaned toward the open passenger window, and motioned to 6'4" Jack to approach. Jack stopped at the front hedges, trimmers in hand. The driver said, "Hey, boy, what do you get for doing a yard like this?" Jack answered, "I get to sleep with the lady of the house." Years later, Jack and Joan told us this story. We four figured the guy was probably a newcomer. It was about this time Joan and Jack bought a used truck for rubbish pickups, the start of Casselberry Company. Now in the living room was a card table with a phone on it. My mother instructed Donna and me how to handle business calls if she could not. Towards the end of the month, we folded bills and licked stamps, put them in a cardboard box, which became boxes to deliver to the post office. Many times after dinner, when Donna faithfully did her homework, my father would say to me, "Want to take a ride?" I never turned down a chance to ride shotgun. First, we went by the jobs he had the next day. What I really liked, though, were the Lake Forest stories he told me as we rode. As we passed Kraft's drugstore one early evening, I learned he worked there in his early teens. He said that there was a beauty shop a few doors down. Jack said one afternoon he was doing a chore on the sidewalk, looked to the right, and saw a lady on a horse barreling toward him, coming up the hill from where about CVS is today. She was coming like a bat out of hell, he said. He described how she expertly made the sharp left turn toward him and stopped. There was a distinct smell of liquor on her breath. As she slipped from her saddle, she slurred, "Park it." The first employee for Casselberry Company was Mr. William Johnson, who migrated from Arkansas to North Chicago or Waukegan, I don't remember which. I didn't meet him for a while, but I heard my parents refer to Willie. One Saturday morning, they called me to the backyard to meet someone. I came down the back door steps and said, "Hi, Willie." Next, their signature silence. Then my dad said, "It's Mr. Johnson to you." He worked for Miss Joan and Jack for more than 30 years. I remember coming home from school, my mother seated in the kitchen. She said my father was upstairs asleep. Mr. Johnson, about 5'5", had driven my father home, then climbed the stairs and carried my 6'4" father to bed. He told my mother they were cleaning a catch basin. In short, my mother said, "Your father worked so hard, he passed out." Casselberry Company hired a second worker, William Murphy, a friend of Mr. Johnson's from Arkansas. Mr. Murphy preferred to keep the name Willie, so Mr. Johnson became Bill. Casselberry Company grew and moved to Roundout. My father wanted someone present 24 hours. He proposed to Mr. Murphy that he include a small apartment for him and his wife, Ella. They said fine, and agreed with Jack to keep a dog for extra protection, who was a black German Shepherd. Then there was a mechanic for the septic tank and garbage trucks, and Jeeps for the snow plowing. One secretary became two, then a staff who worked under my mother who did accounting. Two gas tanks were installed for refueling of the garbage septic tank trucks and more Jeeps for snow plowing. There were more days when I came from school and my mother would say, "Guess what garbage and snow plowing contract we got today? Lake Forest College, merchants in town, new residential customers, Lake Bluff." Jack and Joan were rolling. It takes Rodney Green, our cousin, to tell you about working for Jack in the summer. His story usually begins with a groan. Rodney in high school then lived 3 doors down where his parents built a home. Jackie said would pick him up at 5 a.m. sharp, except when Jack figured Rodney was partying all night. Then Rodney said Jack would purposely arrive 20 minutes early. He always emphasized you couldn't be late with Jack. He said my dad's finishing touch after Rodney poured himself into the Jeep's front seat was to, with his head against the window, my father would lean over and say, "How's it going?" Rodney said in spring a good number of his high school classmates would ask him, "Can you get me a job with Jack this summer?" Rodney sometimes had to repress saying, "Are you sure you want to do that?" Jack was one to give a boy a chance, and some got work. There were summers he couldn't hire them because relatives who might be dealing with a difficult teenager, for example, would ask my parents if their boy could come for the summer, live with us, and work. Spruce Street was a rip-and-run place. At the meeting of Spruce and Edgewood, where's Rochelle Duff, was our home plate during the day. It was where we met to shoot marbles. It was where we met to head for the locked gates of Lake Forest High School football field, slide under them, then have a field to ourselves or the track where we competed in relays. I'd say a minimum of 10 to 15 kids. Spruce and Edgewood was where we met to go to Mr. Cohn's small grocery on McKinley Road. Today, Maxie Cohn's is Carlos Taylor's shop, where there are now neatly trimmed bushes, and in front was where we had our bikes. When you entered the shop, to the left and to the right, there were window seats where we ate our candy or ice cream. It was also a small grocery where parents could pick up mostly anything needed. Mr. Cohn knew our names, mostly called us by the nicknames we had for one another. He had a heavy accent, I think was German. Out of his earshot, we called him Maxie. Out of earshot. His way of kidding us when he took our purchase to the counter and asked how much, when we asked how much, he would answer, "Well, how much you got?" One day, a boy in our group exploded at Mr. Cohn for asking his lighthearted question. He accused Mr. Cohn of being dishonest. It wasn't pretty. That night at dinner, Donna and I told our parents about Mr. Cohn's confrontation. Donna was about 11 years old, which would make me 7, so I know we were still at 421 Spruce. We may have giggled about it. I know the kitchen went dead silent. Finally, my mother spoke. What you need to know is there were days when your father and I were barely making it. No gas in the car and 2 mouths to feed. She said, "Know this. It is the same Mr. Cohn who gave us food on credit, and more than once." End of discussion. For me, the epitome of our summer days was to go east on Spruce, cross Sheridan, then take the dirt road between the cemetery and on the right, the large home of the family who owned the Curtis Candy Company. We broke into a run as we passed the cemetery entrance. The challenge was to be the first to hit the sloping, narrow path ahead with ravine on both sides. We knew it like the back of our hands, and that there was only one for one noisy kid at a time. The goal was to be the first to hit the sands of this empty and very quiet part of Lake Forest Beach. We renamed it Boot Beach, then a term applied to black people. We enjoyed that beach for a good 10 to 12 years. At that time, my grandfather, William Casselberry, was remarried, as you heard earlier, had 4 children and lived on Bradley Road. He also raised chickens. My dad and I rode out there one day. My father said to me, Jackie, you can make some money selling eggs. Rather than telling him I was scared of chickens, I asked how. He said, I know somebody. He drove me to Lake Road, to one of the biggest homes on the lakeside. Parked by the kitchen door, one of the cooks came and welcomed us. My father made me make the pitch. The cook agreed to a weekly price and delivery. The next week, I was washing my first bag of eggs in the kitchen sink. One cracked open. There was no egg. There was an embryo. I screamed. My first business venture ended that same day. I did want to learn how to ride. My father said, I'll find you a place. I couldn't imagine thinking the only option was on Wensia. He said, I'm going to take you to Captain Frank. His stables were on Bradley Road. I can still see my father and Captain Frank leaning on the post outside of the ring. I can still hear the captain admonish me with his distinctive German accent. This is not ballet, toes down. Toes up, toes up. Some years later, Jordan, my daughter, Jack's only grandchild, was 12, spending much of the summer with my mother. My mother was gone then with my father. She took riding lessons on Bradley Road, then owned by Steve Haight. One day, Jordan called me to say emphatically she would not return to the stable. A horse had cornered her in the stall, and she definitely didn't like it. I, who had been a chicken when it came to selling eggs, could only say, okay. This photo is of my cousin Rodney Green and me in front of Lake Forest Baptist Church. The majority of members were from Spruce and from the south end of town. There was Miss Lenore, an older Lake Forester who faithfully played the piano every week, made it to all the practices and presentations for the children's Christmas and Easter programs. There were at least a good 20 of us who attended. After Sunday school, we younger ones would race down the stairs leading from the sanctuary or from the stairs at the church entrance to the basement reading room and kitchen. It was in the kitchen we were hopeful that the ladies would gift us with the grape juice they poured for communion. Our minister was Reverend Jones. After church, he and his wife and son would come to Spruce Avenue and have dinner at one of the homes. We kids were told we had to play with their son Clarence, who was our age. Easier said than done. Clarence wore a suit like his father. Clarence carried a Bible like his father, and he considered us his congregation. So he tried to preach to us like his father. 3 guesses, 2 don't count regarding his conversion rate. Reflections on early school days here in Lake Forest get sweeter with the years. A French teacher from France, Mrs. Colson, who came in autumn and took us to the woods where someone showed us how to tap trees. We pressed fallen leaves on manila construction paper. In early spring, she was at the front of the classroom, and she was turned sideways like this, doing bird calls. Late in spring, she brought in fresh flowers and showed how to cut the stems. Then she produced vases and instructed how to best arrange the flowers. It was idyllic. It was idyllic. I remember when Deer Path School was under construction, they found the arrows of past Native Americans, the first settlers. When all is said and done, it's Deer Path that I most lovingly remember. Like the school song says, it will stand high. It had an exceptional teaching staff, some with doctorates, art, shop, home, economic teachers, in short, exemplary. When my sister was in the 6th grade, she came home, threw herself on the bed, crying, unable to talk. Finally, she told our mom that a new girl in school had called her the N-word. Joan went straight to the phone, of course. I'm not certain, but I think it was Miss Hayward, if some of you remember her. You do? The great Miss Hayward. Then social studies teachers who answered the telephone. She said, Mrs. Casselberry, I was just getting ready to call you. Dr. Pearson, remember the great Dr. Pearson? And I have just ended a meeting with a new student and her parents. We made it clear that what happened today, we do not tolerate at Deer Path. End of discussion of such and similar matters until Donna was on the 8th grade graduation trip to Washington, D.C. I don't know if they still do that. My mother took a call from, I think again, Miss Hayward, who was chaperoning. She said that the class had spent a difficult day, but especially one for my sister. On a sightseeing trip, the kids got thirsty. She said Donna burst into tears when she saw for the first time separate drinking fountains, designated colored and white. She assured my mom now all was okay. I can't completely trust my memory on this, but I think the last words of that conversation were, I got a hard one with this, Mrs. Casselberry, none of us drank. There's a picture in a box I have not located of my sister Donna. She's standing on the stairs of an airplane. To her far right is another stewardess. Between them is former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Donna was one of the first black stewardesses to be hired by Pan Am. She was one of the first black young women to attend Colorado Women's College in Denver. I followed her there. I followed her to San Francisco, where I began working as a journalist at KCBS Radio. By then, she was promoted to Pan Am management. I got a call from her one day asking if I could get a Thursday off, asking if I wanted to fly to Hawaii for the weekend. We went. She and my parents made it so we saw a lot of the world. Donna took me to parts unknown, East Africa safaris, West Africa, Senegal, the island of Gorée, where the first slave ships landed and captives jumped from the cliffs above the shark-infested waters rather than being taken to America. My mother loved traveling with us. Jack used to say, you know, if you give your mother a ticket to hell, she'll pack a bag. My mother, in her special way, prepared me for a morning at work at KCBS Radio in San Francisco. When the assignment editor was handing out stories, he said there was a woman in town representing her husband who had immigrated to Accra, Ghana. Someone, he said, named Dubois. I thought, that's not Dubois. That's Du Bois. One of the great black writers and leaders of the 20th century. A man who went in 1894 to the University of Berlin. A man who was the first PhD at Harvard. Basically, I'm saying, no matter where we were, Donna and I were close to home. There was a day in 1971 Donna called furious, telling my parents to get a copy of the recent Women's Wear Daily. In it was a story about Flossie Curtis, her family prominent in Lake Forest. It read that the heiress had married, then divorced Lake Forester Jack Casselberry, a black man. She had married and divorced a black gentleman, but his name was Clarence McIntosh. Donna was like a dog with a bone. It was the 70s. She added, when are they going to learn we all don't look alike? She would not let it go. Suffice it to say that when the publication printed a retraction, an apology, and a check, Joan and Jack weren't too upset. My sister, who when I was 11 years old, tossed a book on my bed and said, read this. It was an oral history entitled Slave Stories. When we were younger, there was an annual run and rip every summer, and it was called the Penguin Picnic. This lady attended. The Penguins were an African-American men's club, some parents, some not. I remember my father attending the meetings throughout the year to reserve an ample big spot at a forest preserve somewhere between Lake Forest and Evanston. They planned races and ribbons to go with them. There were volleyballs, big tubs of ice with drinks and popsicles. There was picnic morning when my mother, like so many other mothers up and down the North Shore, were frying chicken and making award-winning potato salad. There were more kids who looked like us. When we got in our preteens, there was Jack and Jill, a national organization of African-American mothers. I was in the Evanston chapter, again surrounded and cared for by my mother's childhood friends. They planned monthly events, won a swimming party at Evanston Township High School, ETHS. We kids knew we were swimming in a pool that, when our mothers attended, was actually bricked rather than allow black students to swim with whites. Each summer, there was a national convention in various cities where we met even more kids. It was a wonderful expansion of self. My mother's twin, my Aunt Jean Rankin, was instrumental in introducing the Chicago Lynx to black girls on the North Shore. A significant chapter of, the Chicago chapter is a significant chapter of the National Black Women's Service Organization, known for the strides and services they still contribute to black communities throughout the country. Her older daughter, Debbie, was the first to participate from Glencoe. It was 1964. I followed the following year. The weekly practices started early in spring. My mother drove me to the Chicago meeting place where we learned with our escorts, we were required to have two, the formal choreography of dances for the big evening. She was there with other committed moms from Chicago and Gary, Indiana. Families gave individual parties in homes and lovely penthouses when it got warmer and nice outdoor settings. I call that time the summer of Ain't Too Proud to Beg. A record out by that venerable singing group, The Temptations. When it was played, everybody hit the dance floor. It was our anthem. I thought these teenagers were really cool, and I still do. My mother planned a pre-cotillion lawn party. I remember greeting them, so many wanting to know about the lovely village they had never seen and had just driven through on the way to 386 Spruce. I recall the Casselberry reunions held at 386 Spruce. They were fairly large with old and new faces. Back row was William, my grandfather, and a few of his brothers, sitting, the children and grandchildren. Those were the nights when some kids might sleep with us in the basement because adults had the beds. That could have been the summer of my first win at Arlington Racetrack. Joan loved the track. It was akin to being her summer home. Neighbors who knew when she was going would come over in the morning with a list of their bets. And my mom would promptly organize and, get them perfectly right. Sometimes I joined as she willed her horse across the line. One of those days, I won $50. When my dad came home, I showed him my fortune. He said, "Tomorrow, you're going back." I said, "I am? Why?" He said, "Because odds are you'll lose it." I did. Joan's racing love never diminished. Like the Queen, Joan loved her ponies. This picture was taken after they moved from 386 to 240 Ahwahnee Road. 1 year later, there she was, with her twin, Jean, their childhood friend, Ernestine, and my daughter, Jordan, heading to the track. They were living there the summer of 1965, Lake Forest High School reunion. The class of 1945, my father's graduating class was celebrating too. Joan and Jack invited them for a pre-gathering. I joined my class on the tented lawn of Deer Pass School. At one point, my father and I met in the middle of the tent. I said, "You know, Dad, I feel kind of sad. It seems like Lake Forest has changed so much." He pointed east and he said, "See that house? It was the only one there when I was growing up. Where you were standing and back there was all field." He said, "Jackie, if you don't accept change, you won't make it." When we moved to 386 Spruce, I asked my mother for a canopy bed. She said, "Well, we have to wait on that." I always loved canopy beds. I always loved movies. I think because of all the movies I watched, even at 5 years old, I was talking canopy beds. One day, my parents' best friends, Margaret and Albert Myrick, who were childless, said, "Jackie, we know where you can find one." They lived on the place, on Lake Road, and said their employers were going out of town. They arranged for me to spend the night. When I arrived, Aunt Margaret took me upstairs to the canopy bedroom. I couldn't believe every bedroom had a bathroom. The last room I entered had twin beds, satin comforters. I could imagine a young starlet there. To Aunt Margaret's surprise, I chose that one. At bedtime, she helped me bathe, tucked me in, pointed to the bedside button, and said, "First thing in the morning, push this button, and I'll start your breakfast." I did, and as I entered the kitchen, Uncle Albert escorted me to the breakfast room. All pane glass with a view of the back grounds. He served me breakfast. They treated me to this overnight like a daughter, and did so in this setting once a year for the next 3 years. For decades, both Donna and I had held a special place in their hearts. We learned a lot from them. They took so much time to actually talk to us. One story that fascinated was of their early travels south. Their employer owned 2 other homes, one in Florida and a farm in Virginia. They always drove the family's luxury car to each place. Once they passed the Mason-Dixon line, Aunt Margaret, who was fair-skinned, would transfer to the back seat. Uncle Albert would then put on his chauffeur cap. They said that eliminated stops by police who would want to arrest Uncle Albert because surely he would have stolen such a car. The lot east of 386 was bought by Aunt Margaret and Uncle Albert. The day they broke ground, they and my parents stood above that hole with cocktails and talked about the house to come. I see them there always. There was a man named Edward Cook from Lake Forest who grew up at the south end of town. His photograph and history are mounted across the hall at the exhibit. Professionally, he was known as the Nassau Daddy, radio host and DJ. Eddie Cook and Jack Casselberry were lifelong friends. I was about 6 years old, making Donna 10. The phone rang one evening. An operator said it was a long-distance call from Nassau. The 4 of us crowded around the phone. That had never happened. It was Mr. Cook asking Donna and I what was our favorite record. We told him. Then we heard him say to his audience, "This request from Donna and Jackie Casselberry in Lake Forest, Illinois, my hometown." You know, we were beside ourselves. About 20 years later, Mr. Cook and his wife returned to Chicago, where my mother and father often saw them. Mr. Cook worked at WVO in radio. He played records and did the news. I was working as a reporter at WMAQ News Radio. One very punishing, cold, snowy Chicago night, I was covering a hostage situation. I was walking around unsuccessfully trying to get warm. As I passed a trailer, the door flung open. A voice said, "Jackie, get in here and get warm." It was Mr. Cook, the Nassau Daddy. His words were music to my ears, or as Jack and Joan often said upon getting an unexpected, much-needed plus, it was like a letter from home. One of those days I rode with my father around town. I asked him who he would thank for his business growing. He thought, named some contractors, builders, and basically other Lake Forest and Lake Bluff entrepreneurs who called regularly. I asked, what about Mr. Reed? A name I'd heard often at 386 Spruce, president of Lake Forest Bank. My father said, you're right, Jackie. Frank Reed, Mr. Reed, who gave some of the first loans for Casselberry Company to buy more trucks, for building additions, to put in a good word if someone was considering the company for a hire. They developed a mutually respectful working relationship. My father described meeting days with him, usually dressed in starch-clean khakis and LL Bean insulated jacket and shoes. My father would arrive 10 minutes early, and Frank Reed would say from behind his desk, his office door open, come on in, Jack. Tell me what's on your mind. Tell me what you're thinking. In 1974, I was working in news in Chicago. I got a call from Bill Small, the president of CBS Network News in New York. He is from Chicago, and he went to the University of Chicago. He wanted me in New York to interview for a job at the network. I had to put together a video audition tape. Imri, who I was then dating, helped me do it. A few days before going to New York, I went to the Lake Forest shop to see Gladys, whose name I cannot pronounce, I'm sorry, and nobody else knew how to. I'd first met her when she was working with the mothers on the annual Deer Path fashion show for the 8th grade. She fixed me up. My father drove me to O'Hare. I was seated in front of Mr. Small's desk, a man, like I said, a man from Chicago, when he pulled what, in hindsight, I call a Jack move. He said, it says here that you studied language in Spain and Switzerland. Then he pushed a piece of paper toward me and said, I received this note from my CBS Paris correspondent. Mind telling me what it says? I said, that's Jack. I got the job. I worked in New York for some time, then asked for a transfer to the Atlanta Bureau. Bill Small asked me why. I told him my grandmother was born there, and my mother summered there. He granted it. I chased Governor George Wallace, segregation as governor of Alabama, who was running for president, down an airport corridor to make a deadline. I got ahead of the wheelchair. My shoe got stuck in the front wheel. The governor had to back up. He was not pleased. One day I was told to hustle over to get Henry Kissinger. He was then Secretary of State, who was speaking at a huge fundraiser for Israel. The room packed with money, basically. When I got there, Kissinger was about to take the stage. His minions told me, very self-important minions told me, there was no way I could talk to him. Kissinger overheard the conversation, turned, and saw my CBS camera. He made his large audience of influential donors wait for me. Ha. I covered the Jimmy Carter campaign, and one night talking to my parents, my father said there was no way he would vote for this Southern candidate. I answered, Dad, I have to tell you, Jimmy Carter and his wife are really very nice. You know, they're decent people. He said, no way. On victory night, I called him. Okay, Dad, who'd you vote for? He pulled the sacred trump and answered, secret ballot, Jackie, secret ballot. Around this time, I stopped telling people I was from Lake Forest. I'd say, Lake Forest. Sometimes the response would be, you don't mean Lake Forest, Illinois, right? Yeah, same one. Sometimes I'd say, Lake Forest, and they'd say, well, just when did you move there? I'd say, didn't. The capper was, are you sure? Bill Small transferred me to Chicago when Emory and I decided to get married. Part of his job was to visit bureaus regularly and talk to reporters privately in restaurants. We usually met at a nice restaurant, and this time he brought a fellow executive. That man said, and Jackie, where are you from? I answered, Chicago. The next words I heard were from Bill Small. He said, "Casselberry, you are not from Chicago. You are from Lake Forest." Yes, I am. And now I can direct the jerks to the Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Center, and they can do the talking. I met my husband, Emery King, in 1973 on a story we were both covering in Chicago. We married in 1976. He was nervous to come to 386 Spruce and ask for my hand. He said, "My mother said yes," then flew up the stairs crying. Happy or sad, Joan was known for crying at the drop of a hat. Emery and Jack went to talk at the Nightingale in Highwood. Emery was very nervous. Parenthetically, it might help to share with you my father's two standard replies when asked if he had sons. "Nope, 2 daughters," he said. "Poor man's family." The other reply was, "No, it's best we did not have a boy because Joan would have spoiled him rotten. She would have sewn lace on his jeans." Emery is from Gary, Indiana. Both his parents migrated from New Orleans. His mother's a teacher, his father and grandfather master carpenters. He has an older sister and brother. The longer we've been married, we realize more and more how similarly we've been raised. After the Nightingale lunch, Emery arranged a golf game with my dad, his dad, and his older brother. They decided to meet in the middle at a public golf course. Is it Beverly Hills? That's what I have down here. Is that the name of it? Public, but still very recently integrated. During the game, a white golfer, clearly displeased with this change, wrongly accused them of stealing his ball. They were civil but adamant with the golfer that he was wrong. The golfer finally walked away, still calling them thieves. Emery said, Jack broke the silence when he said, "You know, that guy's not too smart." Emery's father asked, "Why do you say that, Jack?" Jack said, "He can't be that smart to have talked to 4 black guys holding gloves that way." Our wedding day was on April 17, 1976. Donna was my only attendant, Emery's best man, his brother. My mother, an admirer of the outside of Grace United Methodist Church in Lake Bluff. When she went inside, it lived up to her expectations. "Homey," she said. During that time, my father offered me a deal. He said, "Jackie, rather than a wedding, Emery and I could have the cash." I told him, "No, Dad, thanks, but no thanks." Donna, now divorced, had eloped, and I knew my mom loved doing this. The reception was at the Harrison House. True to form, Joan had the joint jumping. She hired an Evanston band, her contemporaries who were starting out when they were all teenagers. At one point, I met my father in the middle of the room. We watched as a guest left the buffet with a big plate stacked with shrimp. I said, "Goodness." My father said, "It's his second trip." And he said, "And he's eating your money." Later, when Bill Small, who was president of CBS News, he became president of NBC News. He hired my husband, Emery. We moved to Washington, D.C., and Emery was quickly promoted from general assignment to the White House at the beginning of the Reagan administration. Their crew, he was with John Palmer and Andrea Mitchell, I have to say that. Their crew was the first all-black crew to cover the White House. Check that out. And they were something. First Lady Nancy Reagan always looked for Cameraman Percy because he photographed her best. Plus, she just liked these gentleman guys. She liked Emery because she said on the day there was an assassination attempt in 1981, Emery was the only one who rightly reported she was not out shopping when it occurred. And if you remember the footage of Reagan at the hospital window when he was hit, you will hear the president only respond to one question. It was Emery who asked it. And we think the First Lady had something to do with that. My parents visited Washington often. At the time, they owned Allcass with the Aldrich family, which was great because Emory was always on the road. So I spent a lot of time with them, my parents and my German Shepherd, Carmine. I also worked as press secretary to the director of the Peace Corps, then Kennedy Foundation, and finally press secretary to Ambassador and cabinet member Patricia Roberts Harris, who unsuccessfully ran for DC mayor. Emory invited Jack to the South Lawn to watch the president take off in a helicopter. My mother had previously been, and she said, oh, how nice, you know. Does he play cards? Okay. It was at the end of the Reagan administration's, end of Reagan's first term. Among the declared Democratic opponents, former Vice President Walter Mondale and the Reverend Jesse Jackson. The day my father went, I went because I wanted to watch him watch them. I watched him study the movements of the men, the ones who wore suits, the ones who wore uniforms, the guy who had the black box, the military precision, who got on the helicopter and who did not. As the helicopter flew out of sight, I said, Dad, what do you think? He said, Jackie, Jesse Jackson can forget it. One day in 1991, my parents were visiting us at our then home in Rochester, Michigan. I was in the kitchen, Jack, Joan, and Jordan in the den watching the evening news. My father had had strokes by then, and he was on a cane, and you could hear it when he walked. All of a sudden, I heard Jordan, 5 years old, running down the hall toward me, emphatically yelling, I am not, I am not, I am not. I heard my father's metal cane clanking as he followed, responding, yes, you are, but it's okay. It's going to be okay. I looked at him for an explanation. He said, well, we were watching the news, and the footage of the Rodney King LA cops beating was played. She asked us about it, and, you know, we told her as best we could as a child, but we happened to mention to her and say, you know, Jordan, you're black too. But we hadn't had that conversation with her, right? Putting that two and two together would scare any child. But my parents, perhaps too soon, presented it as a point of information. Like Donna and me, Jordan was made aware early of her so-called differences. My sister thought, and I still do, that in the scheme of things, it was preferable to be forewarned, therefore forearmed. Joan and Jack paved our road. I have not one regret. They steadied me on that road, and I hope in the end is the one less taken. Who's that? Oh. When Jordan graduated from Cranbrook schools, there was and is the tradition to have someone special present your class pin. She called Ronald Machen, a Cranbrook alumnus, as was his sister Margot, who also volunteered to come. They are the great-great-grand-nephew and niece of my maternal grandmother, Daisy Cohen. He also congratulated Jordan that her class successfully had the prominent statue of Robert E. Lee removed, an effort they had begun 20 years ago. Jordan went on to Denison University. After 2 years, she said she did not want to return. Emory and I were frustrated by that because, in addition, she said she wanted to act. One day, when she and I were sitting in lawn chairs on a lake in Bloomfield, Michigan, where we lived then, our dachshund Daisy with us, her phone rang. She said only 7 words during that call. Hello, you've made my life, and thank you. The call was from Lambda, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts. The person speaking told Jordan she had been accepted for this prestigious 3-year program to study acting. During graduation week with a diploma from the University of Kent, Emery and I did what Joan and Jack would have done. We threw a party. She remained 2 years in London, acted in small roles with Judi Dench, Kevin Costner, Kenneth Branagh. Then the British residency requirement laws changed. Either you had to be married or you had to buy property. Jordan returned home, tried work in New York, where she worked at, Labyrinth Theater, then Steppenwolf in Chicago, then decided to move to Los Angeles. I could never do what you do, especially there, taking jobs whenever you can to support yourself and your craft. Being here tonight on her own steam for her grandparents, whose words are her inspiration. Joan would say, "Nothing beats a failure but a try." And Jack, anything can happen, anything. In the early 1980s, Jack and Joan moved to Ahwahnee Road. It was there I learned for the first time in a casual conversation that decades before, they had replaced the much-needed baptismal pool at the Lake Forest Baptist Church. There are other stories like that they didn't share with Don and me. Later, after their deaths, people told us how Jack and Joan helped them. I did overhear one story. One summer, as my father met with a person on Ahwahnee Road, they had a screened porch. I could overhear the conversation. At the close of the conversation, that person said, "Jack, when do you require repayment?" My father answered, "You tell me, and make it easy on yourself." On Ahwahnee, the Killer Midwest games continued, Joan and Jackie versus Jack and Emery. By then, Emery was used to them. He'd heard it all before. Jack would lose a game because Joan was holding the last trump. He'd respond, "Joan, I knew you had it." Joan said, "No, you did not, Jack. You might have thought I did, but you did not know it." Their only daughter, Jackie Casselberry King. She was born in 1986 in Rochester. I'm going to skip that. But what was so great about Jordan and Lake Forest, I'm looking at Tina Hansen right now. Her mother, Mrs. Hansen, I wish I had the pictures, who then lived around the corner, would have Jordan come to the young folks shop and wait on people. You know, that's the same woman who, at my mother's funeral, stood and said how wonderful it was to raise their children together. It was from Ahwahnee Road we got the call from Jack and Joan regarding business they'd completed that day. That was long before my father had a series of strokes and my mother died suddenly. No, this was a happier day. Funny to Donna, Emery, and me, and Jordan. The news was that they had secured 5 burial plots at Lake Forest Cemetery. Toward the back, on the road, with a ravine on the other side. We were thankful that Joan and Jack had yet again left no stone unturned. But like I said, funny. During the 60s, my parents were great at talking to us about race. One discussion was about Uncle Toms, defined in Webster's as a black person excessively servile, obedient to white people, a person regarded as betraying their culture. We were going back and forth. Finally, my father said, "Well, let me tell you a story about one of the richest families in Lake Forest." It was the late 1940s, 1950s. He said they were known for not hiring colored. One day, the lady of the house did hire a colored butler with a wife and 2 daughters. Jack said one of the butler's duties was to, just before dinner ended, he would go to her library, light a fire, and then place a cup of coffee and a glass of water by her favorite chair. When she was settled, he was obliged to leave the room without turning his back on her. That was not allowed. He was to bow repeatedly out of the room while saying, "Good night, Mrs. X, good night, Mrs. X, good night, Mrs. X," till he was out. My father said, "Is that an Uncle Tom?" Don and I didn't know. He asked, would it help if I added that that same lady, again in the late 1940s, put both of his daughters through college. We still said nothing. My dad spoke. You do what you have to do, no matter what. I'm pretty sure my mom added, you know, so-called Toms aren't exclusively black. In 1996, about 2 a.m., my mother's caretaker sent my father's caretaker to my bedroom to wake me. He said, Diane says you must get up. Your mother's dying. I waited in her den at the front of the house for the ambulance. Outside was a beautiful snow. I saw an owl in a tree she had previously described to me. We went to Lake Forest Hospital that used to be a home and then felt like home. Her friends from Evanston, Lake Forest came to say goodbye. Don and I took shifts. Mine was the overnight. A Lake Forest nurse came in and asked me, would I like to hear my mother's heart? I did. At the funeral home, Fran Hansen, owner of the Young Folks Shop, rose to talk about their times of raising children together. The Aldridges were there. Emery's father sang. As I was about to leave from Winbin's front door, I looked to the right, and 3 friends were standing to the side just waving at me. Friends from nursery school. There was a reception at the Deer Path Inn. It took a long time to acknowledge the many people. Her same high school musicians that she hired for my wedding were now a combo, played. But if forced to remember just one moment of that day, it would be at her gravesite. As I was about to leave, a young woman walked up to me. She said, I know you don't know me, but I had to come today. There was a time when I was young, broke, pregnant, and unmarried. After giving birth, the day I left the hospital, there were baby clothes, a bassinet, a check, and my hospital bill was paid. She said, I had to come today. I could hear Joan say to her, now listen, this is just between you and me. I could just hear her saying it. Jack's death. After my mother died, Jack stayed on a while at Awani Road, but after a few years, he felt he had to leave. We knew it was because he was leaving for us, just like the grave sites. He was getting things ready for us. He moved to 140 East Franklin, a condo, kept his caregivers, made a place for Jordan, who still visited in summer. The last time I saw him, we were in the living room. I stood over him because he was in a wheelchair. He knew I had to leave for a piano recital Jordan was having in a few days. He looked up at me, and I saw the questions in his eyes. I answered, Dad, I'm all right. We're all right. He died the morning of the recital. We were driven to the cemetery by Winbin. Ray Sonny Green, who was Rodney's brother, some of you may remember, he was very close with Jack, followed in the family car. As we headed for the gravesite, to the left, I saw a huge stag with beautiful horns. At the gravesite, Sonny asked, did you see that stag? I said, yeah, I did. When we left the gravesite, Sonny and I rode together in the family car. Sonny exclaimed, there's the stag. That's Jack. And I said, I know. Yeah, I know. We kept the condo for a while, so we never left Lake Forest. It's always going to be home. Donna still lived here. After a long, difficult illness, she died in 2014. When we arrived at her gravesite, the driver at Winbin's whispered to me, I brought her by way of spruce. When I was able, I went to her condo to ready it for sale. The day the movers came, I had just a small stack of papers to read. When the movers were done, I had the last envelope to open. Inside was cash, the exact amount of the move. About 3 years ago, we moved back permanently, last of the home fires. We spent a lot of time at the kitchen table. Sometimes on a winter evening, Emery will say, "It's going to snow." And I'll say, "No, it's not." And sometimes he'll say, "It's going to snow." And I'll say, "Yeah, but it's not going to stick." Sometimes he'll say, "It's going to snow." And I said, "Better get to the grocery store." From that kitchen, we listen for the noon whistle. In the evening, we anticipate the coming of the lamplights and think, as Jack often said about Lake Forest, this is the place. Since moving here permanently, I've had the honor of serving on the Lake Forest Committee for the Vets, ably chaired by Mark Shields of Lake Forest High School, class of '66. Like everybody else on that committee, they are diligent, competent in putting our veterans first. I also served with Rodney, my cousin, who's a Vietnam vet, on that. He told me the story about the day he left Vietnam and touched base on American soil in Los Angeles. He called Jack and Joan from there and asked them to pick him up at O'Hare. He said he didn't want to worry his mother one more minute. He wanted her to see him on her doorstep. Joan and Jack delivered her to that front door. Mark Haryu, class of '66, surprised me during a break in a Zoom meeting. He said, "Jackie, your parents were the nicest people." After all these years, I thought, I was deeply, deeply touched. Never did I imagine there would be this night. They certainly did not. I leave you with one last story, maybe image of Jack. There was some discussion as to whether I should tell it, because if nothing else, the language involved. Emery, Jordan, and Laurie Stein voted me out, so I just want you to know I lost. Laurie Stein, yes, that's the man he was. Tell it. There's this book, To the Manor Born. Probably some of you have seen it. But it was compiled of photographs taken of privileged Lake Foresters. The subjects agreed to participate under the condition that their names not be used. I bought it for my father, who named 90% of them. And I forgot to take notes. One of the women in that book was someone my parents liked very, very much. She was a lovely lady. My father had a soft spot for her. And when he would snowplow her driveway, which was very long, he would go at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, so it was cleared for evening, and then he'd return at 4 a.m. to make sure her husband could get out in the morning. One 4 a.m. morning, he was checking on the job. The lady's son came home from a late night out. He said, "Oh, Mr. Casselberry, Mummy is going to be so pleased when she wakes and sees the driveway." My father answered, "And your mother's going to shit a brick when she gets the bill." So said the man who was the boy in the blackamoor costume. It's been lovely to be here with you tonight. All of you are just so terrific. Thanks. I got it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Jackie. So on that note, I think we'll conclude our review of the Centennial family's history in Lake Forest. So now I'd like to ask our Executive Director, Carol Summerfield, to come up to help me with the presentation of the awards, which are right back there. So this Centennial Award is not just a celebration. And this year more than any other, it's a recognition of the dedication that our nominee family has made in researching and documenting and sharing their family history. They should be commended for the information they've pulled together, the beautiful writing, their willingness to share it with us all. I'd also like to thank a few far-flung family members who are not here with us today, Karen Young and Ted Casselberry, for their help with the genealogy research. They were invaluable. So I would now like to recognize the Casselberry family, and then in a moment have the family's representatives, Jackie Casselberry King and maybe Jim Casselberry the third, come to the podium to accept the award. So we're delighted to present the 2023 Centennial Family Awards. Will all the members of the Casselberry family please stand? All right. Okay, congratulations. So will Jackie and James Casselberry please come to the podium for the presentation? Just stand here. All right. There you go. We can do photos.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, there will be many photos, and we'll have family members join. I want to just add that one of the absolute benefits of doing this job is the ability to bring stories to life, and I cannot imagine a better demonstration than what you all have done for us here. It is the way we're able to keep these stories alive, and we're able to keep them for the future, and it is only through the generosity of families like yours who contribute these stories to us to keep. And so it is with great pride that we offer you this memorial of 100 years of an amazing history. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.